Hello, everyone. So today we'll be interviewing Dr. Brian Wong, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at HKU. So I guess we'll start off by asking what got you interested in philosophy.
Well, thank you very much, Benjamin. First of all, massive congratulations on your exceptional venture and the wonderful work you're doing.
Thank you.
When I was a child, I'd always had a knack for asking questions, asking irritating questions to parents, to teachers, to classmates about all sorts of, shenanigans. But one of the key dimensions that kept cropping up is the why part. So when my parents would tell me, "Oh, you really ought to do some exercise," because as you can
Mm,
see, I was addicted to it, and I still am addicted to lots and lots of reading. I was a nerd back then, so that didn't really take much motivating on their part. I was less convinced. Okay, let's put it that way. When
yeah.
it came to, for instance, exercising. So my parents would say, "You need to do more exercise." I'd say, "Why?" And the answer they'd give me is, "Well, because it makes you healthy." And they'd say, "Why does that matter?" Okay, so and so on and so forth. It got to a point where eventually my parents said, "Enough of all these questions you're asking. Why don't you go and read up on the importance of health and the biological case for exercising, cardiovascular diseases, carcinogens, all of that, so on and so forth." In that very process, I, of course, came to be acquainted with something that would come back to haunt me. And that was the fact that exercising is not my strong suit or forte, and that PE lessons, as interesting as they were to many of my classmates, were often, a torturous experience for yours truly. But in the very process of reflecting upon what I liked and what I didn't like, and also why we were compelled into or encouraged very strongly, okay, nudged or even mandated to within the confines of the school and academic setting to enroll in PE classes. In that very process, I came to grapple with questions of obligation, of
Mm,
well-being, and ultimately of purpose. And all of these were, areas that pointed me towards the study of ethics and, more broadly speaking, philosophy. So I would say what got me interested in philosophy was just this insatiable desire to ask questions that were very hard to answer, and it also rendered me a rather an unpopular persona non grata in the eyes of some of my classmates, because whenever they'd say, "Well, why don't you come and hang out with us or spend some time with us? Let's go party." I'd say, "Why do you want to go party? What's the point of partying?" I'd really be a literal party pooper in that sense. But I took pride in doing so, in being the resident nerd and also the resident budding philosopher in my class at high school. And I guess that's what got me interested as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old teenager. Yeah.
yeah, that's a very interesting story. So you're basically like a Socratic kind of figure, just like questioning
Like a sort
everything.
of inadvertent, unwitting Socratic, right? Who's almost forced into it in virtue of my social awkwardness.
Yeah. So now more about like the present. What do you enjoy most about your career?
As we filmed this interview, just yesterday, I got this fantastic piece of news that the student I supervised over the summer, an exchange student visiting Hong Kong for 2 months, had won a very exclusive award,
Oh,
celebrating her achievement for having put together an exceptional paper, on communitarianism. I'm not going to go into detail there because that's her own privacy, but I really do feel, incredibly proud of her and elated on her behalf. And that to me speaks to what I find most interesting about my current line of work. I'm an academic, I'm a scholar, I'm a teacher, a strategist, but also I like speaking with the public, engaging with the community, all because of one underlying reason, which is I believe in the transformative potential of education.
mm,
And that's what I enjoy the most. There are a few things, few better things that a teacher could feel than seeing the students succeed and thrive in life. It is that sense of, achievement, of holistic achievement, that really drives teachers to do all sorts of crazy things like marking hundreds of essays, you know, over a weekend, or spending extensive periods of time with their students, mentoring them, helping them overcome barriers, figure out the life pathways. These are all, in many ways, right? People would say thankless tasks, okay? But to me, they're not thankless insofar as we can feel an innate sense of satisfaction and also fulfillment coming from them as teachers. So, what I find most exciting about the work I do, promoting philosophy, encouraging people to think politically or through lenses of political philosophy, is the demonstrable impact this has on how people approach
mm,
lives, but also approach thorny issues of societal and public concern, and above all, in empowering them to recognize and harness their own voices, because we all have our own voices. And frankly, the reason why we don't feel confident enough to sort of utter something or to enunciate something using our voice is often because we internalize narratives of inadequacy. We now internalize claims that we're not good enough. And what teachers have to do is to say, no, you are good. You may not be good enough to be perfect, but you are good enough to speak. And you should always seek to speak and trial and error, as opposed to foregoing the opportunity to voice your mind. And for me, the most rewarding part then of being a professor here in Hong Kong is to bring forth and to the public attention and consciousness topics ranging from social epistemological discussions concerning epistemic injustice, all the way through to how we ought to apply ancient Chinese and also Western philosophies to understanding and dissecting, the ethics of AI and the governance of AI. So I'm fascinated by the variety. I'm humbled by the curiosity, and ultimately, I'm truly grateful for the opportunity in general to be a part of this wonderful institution that's HKU, and to be part in my home city where I was born and raised, right here in Hong Kong. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very beautifully put. And I think it's just a reminder of how all academia ultimately serves the goal of social good. And it's more like a
Yes. Well, the
communal
who
activity.
society and who social good, who gets to
Yeah.
define social good is also a fascinating question
Mm.
with
Yeah, definitely.
definitional power, so to speak.
Mm. Okay, so I guess we'll start. I was looking at your research. I noticed that you wrote a paper on relational injustice. So could you maybe explain what that is?
For sure. To understand relational injustice, we have to look at or the two components of the term, right?
Mm.
Before delving into the actual definition.
Yeah.
The first is the relational, and the second is injustice. Injustice seems obviously definable and clear as is, but I would actually say it's not as straightforward as we think it is, because injustice must be differentiated from unfairness, from pure harm, or even wrongness. And I would say an injustice arises when an individual has a justifiable ground for complaint. Okay. And that in turn, renders injustice probably the most closely related to wrongness. But then there's a further addendum that in the instance of, or in the case of injustice, there need not necessarily be intentionality. It could just be an unjust distributive arrangement or state of affairs,
Mm.
or it could also be the product of unjust processes, that culminate in a seemingly distributively just, but in fact substantively unjust outcome because of the procedural prelude leading to that outcome. So in short, injustice and wrongness are related, but there need not be an element of human agency and intentionality and injustice
Mm.
vis-a-vis, of course, wrongness. But in the context of relational injustice, I do posit and I do submit that there needs to be an element of interaction between more than one human agent in order for there to be
Yeah.
injustice in that sense. This is very different from, say, hermeneutical injustice, right? Where I, for instance, may lack the resources to comprehend or understand my lived experiences through no fault of others or no fault of an individual agent. But in the case of relational injustice, there is indeed an other agent that is responsible, or at least is implicated in injustice vis-a-vis yours truly. Let's talk about relational. So when we speak of, wrongness, right, or individual X wronging Y, we often focus on Y. Okay, Y's state of affairs, Y's rights, Y's claims. Okay, or X's. We can describe that as a case of X infringing upon the rights, inducing negative states of welfare, causing welfare losses and harms to Y. That's one way of describing events through moral terms. The other way of looking at things is through virtue ethics, where we say X is behaving in a way that contravenes what a virtuous agent would do if they were under X's circumstances. Okay, so X is not behaving as a virtuous agent. We sort of identify through lenses of virtues and vices the impropriety of X's conduct, but we don't say things like X is violating rules or not fulfilling their duties. That's not what virtue ethicists would say, unless they are the rulers, so to speak, as Hursthouse is. But I propose an alternative to both frameworks. I say that maybe what's needed here is to look at the relationship between X and Y and treat it as something unto its own, which is to say it's not fungible with relationship between X and alpha, X and Z, X and beta, X and gamma, right? And an X and Y is a unique dyad. Why is this helpful? Because this means that when it comes to specific injuries, say I punch you, okay? Well, it might be that because I punch you, you therefore get $100 or $100,000 or $1,000,000, okay, from someone who really sympathizes you, and you say, oh, you're net much better off having been punched than not. But that doesn't therefore mean that my punching you is not A, something that is wrong, or B, going one step further, unjust because of the relationship between you and I,
Mm.
where I took advantage of you I damaged you and I'm not suffering any penalty as a result of my, or
Yeah.
despite my having injured you. So by advancing a view of relational injustice, what I was trying to do with that 2019 paper is explain why even if colonialism had brought it more, benefits and harms to the Hong Kong population, even if that were true, that doesn't necessarily mean that, there's no cause or no case to answer for, on the part of those who perpetrated colonialism. Because even if folks had materially benefited, just as you were by the $1 million paid to you after I punched you in your face, that doesn't therefore mean I didn't wrong you and the colonizers didn't wrong the individuals who were wronged. In fact, going one step further than wrongness, I would say the relationship itself is one that is unjust. Okay, was unjust between the colonizers and colonized populations, right? And now that I look back at that paper, I'd say, of course, there were lots of nuances and subtleties and variations. Not everyone amongst the colonized was hurt to the same degree or was, unjustly wronged to the same degree or was implicated in this unjust relationship to the same degree. And nor was I suggesting that everyone and all in a colonizing community ought to bear the same and equal shares of liability. Recognize that liability is a very different question from describing and interpreting the nature of the moral dynamic at work here. What I was merely advocating was that there was relational injustice, perpetrated or induced by colonizers. And while some might have been more responsible than others and ought to have taken up more liabilities than others, that shouldn't affect our judgment of the existence of relational injustice between two communities back then. And that is essentially what this concept's about. I hope that's clear. There are also some incidental features, right, that I can highlight and point to in relational injustice. And that is, firstly, they must be a group characteristic based form of prejudice towards certain demographic groups that is in turn institutionalized, right? Institutionalized through formal structures, state mediated structural injustice, to paraphrase Manta Velo, who recently put together a very interesting book on that question. And at its very core, relational injustice tracks the relationship between two or more specific individuals, assuming that separateness of person holds and the importance of focusing on the individual relationship with others or the individual's dynamics and interactions with others, as opposed to the individual as an atomistic entity on their own. Okay, so that's my conception, so to speak.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it sounds like you're moving away from this traditional ethical way of looking at agents and like the moral agents and like their individual activities and more about like the interactions themselves. And I think that's a good way to move.
For sure, for sure.
Okay, so the next question is what characterizes an equal relation in your opinion?
Really. So I would say this, right? Equality and identity must not, despite the tempting nature of so doing, be conflated. Equality refers to, I would say, all else being equal, three possible definitions. Equality in welfare, so folks are equally as well off as one another. Secondly, equal in treatment by others, so they are treated in a way that is equivalent and identical to one another only in terms of the attitudes and the status that they're accorded to by others, that others hold and espouse when interacting with them, but they're not equivalent in all other meaningful senses. There are variations. And thirdly, it could also be equality with regards to the relationship, right? And this is the definition I want to focus the most of my time on, really, that the relation here is one that has both of them equally capable of influencing the other. So that is almost like a Republican / domination literature inspired definition of equality. Definition one can be broadly captured through welfarist measurements. So you look at how well A is and how well B is. And of course, you could be a hedonist, you could be a preference or desire fulfillment theorist, you could also be an objectivist account advocate, or all three of the above, a hybridist, so to speak, when it comes to what your theory of well-being is. It doesn't matter. What matters is that whatever theory you use, so long as you apply it consistently, you yield the results that A and B are equally well off. That to me is a possible, but neither necessary nor sufficient way of reading into an equal relation. Because you can easily imagine a world where two brothers equal, hand in hand, they are good comrades, brothers who treat one another with real respect, who both decide to buy a lottery ticket. One of them wins a lottery, the other doesn't. Does that therefore mean that they are unequal? Maybe in terms of the wealth, yes, but are they therefore, is the relationship between them unequal, right?
Yeah.
I would posit no, because they are ultimately, at the very least in how they interact with one another, by all intents and purposes, equivalent and identical in status, standing, and influence. We'd, of course, talk about what money can and can't buy, but that seems almost somewhat peripheral, and also besides the point. Peripheral too, and besides the point, because the point is about how they relate to others and how they relate to one another as well within that context. So the second definition then is to see equality as how others treat them. Okay, so you and I are equal if others treat us in exactly identical manners, at the very least, in sufficiently identical manners, right? Or sufficiently near identical manners. Again, not opposed to this being a plausible criterion. That is, again, neither necessary nor sufficient when it comes to equality in our relationship. Okay, so the quality of our relationship. It's not necessary because it could very well be that of all the people that we know, there's one person who really likes you and hates me, and that everyone else we know feels and treats us as friends. So then there's a difference in how others are interacting with us. We're not wholly the same in how we're situated to others in our societies. And yet that difference does not seem to matter in terms of our personal relationship, because I see you and you see me as equals and equivalents. But then that begs, of course, a further question, which is, what does it mean when I say X sees Y as an equal and Y sees X as an equal? And that is perhaps a third definition, and the most convincing one comes in. And this is one concerning domination. Is it possible for me to unilaterally alter what you decide to do more so than you can unilaterally alter what I do? And is there a greater possibility that my actions could influence and shape what you do than what your actions, or than the probability that your actions could influence and shape mine? That, to me, is a definition of a domination-centered account, one in which arbitrary interference, aka domination, is used to support and anchor our conception of equality. And a world where both parties or all parties in a dyadic or triadic or more relationship, respectively, are able to dominate one another or not be dominated by one another to exactly the same extent, that is when I would say the relationship is equal. So you can easily imagine a world where you have hundreds of enslaved individuals who are enslaved to the same master and mutually beholden to one another to the same degree. And here we could say that, well, yes, there is indeed equality amongst the slaves. The relationship is one of equality, in brackets, equal suffering, but equality nonetheless. And yet, is this the kind of society we'd like to lead in or live in, given the leveling down and also the net value or the negative impacts on our welfare? That I do not necessarily know, but I would posit that the answer is probably a no. We don't want to live in a world where we're equal, our relations are equal, and yet we are all destitute and poor. And that also accounts for why, therefore, even if inequalities were to materialize in certain instances of economic development, that might still be better than a world where there's no development whatsoever because of stagnation and also an excessive emphasis upon equality per se, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a very detailed account.
Great. Fantastic.
So aside from colonialism, what other examples of relational injustice are there? I think you gave the example of like punching, but like are there any like more like tangible or
Absolutely.
practical examples?
Sexual assault, financial crimes and embezzlement, genocides, authoritarian mass subjugation of populations, authoritarian regimes, non-democratic regimes, or democratic states buying into, or disseminating propaganda that mistreats their citizens and instrumentalizes them as tools and pawns in accomplishing desired and particular desired objectives. These are all germane episodes and instances of relational injustice,
Yeah.
which is ubiquitous throughout our everyday lives. And even, actually, in a classroom, a teacher that teaches a particular ideology, creationism, for instance, okay, or conspiracies, that too is a case of a relational injustice, provided that the teacher is intentionally teaching this to advance a political cause, because there's clearly a weaponization of the office and also an attempt to trigger or to weaponize that power differential to score certain objectives that is not respectful to one, at least one, if not more, of the parties involved in that particular dialogue or conversation. So these are all examples of relational injustices.
Yeah, thank
And
you
what
for
about
that.
you? Can you name me an example, Benjamin?
I guess
Do like it when I get to ask you
yeah.
questions.
I think maybe slavery would be relational injustice, but
For
then
sure.
at the
Is
same time, maybe it's
capitalism, do you
not.
think capitalism is a relational injustice or like extremely
Mm,
unbridled and unregulated, say a working environment with poor labor laws? Is
yeah,
that is that a form of relational injustice? And
I
if so,
guess
between who?
from like a Marxist account, maybe from like the difference between the working classes and like the bourgeoisie. But then I think it's also possible for the working classes to move to the upper classes through acquiring wealth through capitalism. But then that's a bit
Right.
more difficult.
But the fact that if I punch you today and you say, well, tomorrow you can punch me back, doesn't therefore,
Mm,
obviate the domination I could exercise, I am exercising over you at this instant, right?
yeah.
You could argue that by actively activating that punch, I'm therefore foregoing domination in the abstract sense, and I'm in fact, turning the domination into a form of interference, right? To use the lingo of Republican theorists, C.F. Pettit, Skinner, and others along those lines. Rorty isn't quite Republican, but you get the gist. Yes.
Mm. So if
So,
capitalism is a relational injustice, then what should be done in response to that?
I don't actually think it is, but if it were,
Oh,
then I suppose we can make capitalism more egalitarian. We can ensure that we strip capital from the machine of concentration and unbridled accumulation, and in so doing, empower citizens to fight back, empower citizens to
mm,
resist against undue inequalities whilst embracing the capitalist magic as it stands. So I don't think capitalism need necessarily be unduly exploitative and also exclusionary,
yeah.
let stratifying, so to speak, right? That's a contingent as opposed to an innate aspect of capitalism logic, passe or contrast, contra Marx and co on the views in that front.
Mm, yeah, that's a more nuanced opinion, I guess. So if a relation between two individuals is initially unequal, but then later becomes an equal relation, would that relation still be unjust? I think you talked about like, if you punch me and I punch you back, I guess that's maybe like making the relation equal again, but then in a way it still seems intuitively that's
Does
wrong.
does it make us whole again? I would like to make this very clear. I don't think so. I don't think we'd ever completely neutralize
Mm,
past wrongs, especially if it were more than just resource based, but say physical or corporal. I punched you, you punched me. That's perhaps on the lighter end. But what if it were my severing your ear and you severing
yeah,
my ear? That doesn't make either of us as well off as had the action not occurred. And it certainly doesn't restore our relationship to one where there is no more relational injustice. It should instead be that our history is filled with relational injustices, indeed, as epitomized by retaliatory violence and also unprovoked aggression and violence embedded within that, right? So I would say two histories are flawed, two histories of the subject being wronged do not thereby render the subjects in question equivalent in status, let alone relationally equal or related to one another in a just manner, right? Justice is an all things considered concept. It tracks history, it tracks past track record, it looks at what's gone on previously. And frankly, if I were indeed a victim in the past, that my perpetrator is now also suffering does not negate, it does not obviate the wrongness in the initial setup and also the occurrences of those particular
mm,
episodes of injustices. Does that make sense to you?
yeah. So like the relations themselves are constituted by their past and their histories.
Exactly. It's a multi-dimensional concept.
Mm. So do you think if like relational injustice cannot ever be truly like fully made right, then do you think like decolonial projects have any use at all?
Well, decolonial projects can't change the histories of
Yeah.
colonization. But what they can do is to firstly alter trivially the either the present fact of colonization still taking place and occurring, which is a thing, mind you, through economic means, neo-colonialist institutions. Colonialism is still an ongoing phenomenon, and even colonialism within countries by the majoritarian population against minority population, so to speak, right? So the
Mm.
first and foremost priority and duty of those pushing back against colonialism is to put an end to present day injustices. But secondly, also to garner growing salience and attention over past victims. Again, we can't make past victims completely whole again. There's no way of of totally neutralizing
Yeah,
the abhorrence of colonialism, but there are ways of approximating said, neutralization through what we call, to some extent, a calibrated approximation or a pragmatic approximation in our compensatory efforts, right? And just because we can't reach the destination and hit the goal on the mark doesn't mean we oughtn't try and get to the mark. And that's also why I don't buy into this. We can't compensate all the victims. Some of them are dead. Let's not try then, sort of reductionist logic that we
yeah,
hear concerning reparations. And finally, we owe it to the past to prevent the future from being equally, if not
yeah, definitely.
equally as bad, if not worse, right? That's in many ways true what the victims themselves might have wanted. They would have wanted subsequent generations in posteriority to be immune from and to not suffer from the same plight as they did, because of how horrible, how atrocious and callous their experiences were in the past. So I would suggest another way of redressing historical wrongs is to look to the future and practice what, say, I think Sonny Kim, I believe that's his name, Kim Hon Chan argued, to be a crucial aspect of forward-looking reparative justice, right? And thinking through really carefully as to what is and isn't feasible and acting accordingly. I think he talked about this in structural transformation and reparative obligation, reinterpreting the beneficiary pays principle in an article last year, and that's Sonny Kim. Yeah.
Thank you. So according to this, if it's completely a future oriented approach, do you think like the past colonizers should still bear moral responsibility or face any kind of punishment for their past actions?
Say we're taking a purely consequentialist approach, which I presume
Yeah,
to be the plausible basis of a forward-looking account. There surely exists still consequentialist value in punishment as a means of deterrence, as a means of restricting and limiting the extent to which present day perpetrators or accomplices to perpetrators or special interest groups derived off and benefiting from, perpetrators. We can still limit the extent to which they are able to exercise damage through their advocacy, lobbying, and agenda. And that in of itself is already quite desirable. But furthermore, we can deter, similar bad faith actions or even, self-anointed good faith actions by discouraging folks from engaging in, colonial or de facto colonialist activities abroad and elsewhere. So I do think that even from a forward-looking perspective, there's much value, okay, much value in ensuring that justice is swiftly and also adequately delivered for all parties involved. And I haven't even gone on to the signaling and communicator functions or the sort of educational value of
yeah,
really trying to, demonstrate that there are norms we can't cross and lines we can't permit, and that is to me what forward-looking policies and also duties ought to be anchored in.
So could you maybe like give some examples of how these policies would look like? Because I feel like it would be a bit wrong.
Think about the veneration of
Yeah,
figures like Cecil Rhodes or other complicit participants in a colonial project. The backlash and a criticism of Cecil Rhodes kickstarted a very productive and fruitful multi-year campaign centered around a Rhodes House to re-examine his legacy. And now, thanks to the warden, Elizabeth Kish, if you walk into Rhodes House, you will see artifacts, paintings, murals, and photos depicting both, the contributions that Cecil made to the foundation per se, but also the horrors of colonialism and apartheid South Africa and
yeah,
also Rhodesia, so on and so forth. So it's yeah, of course, Rhodesia is a different story from South Africa, to be very clear, right? But it is fair to say that there's such a deep intertwinement between, for instance, figures like Cecil Rhodes and victims of colonial inquest and conquest, such that by looking at the past, we are in fact helping future generations to deal with the present and to cope with the present. And because we want to serve the present and the future generations, that's why we can't run away from the past, so to speak. So the forward and the backward looking components of reparative justice, or more broadly speaking, commemorative historical injustice, are intertwined and inseparable.
yeah.
Another
So oh yeah, sure, go ahead.
you can think of is about efforts in the Philippines and also in Indonesia to push for reparations and also compensation over the wrongdoings of the Marcos regime, Ferdinand Marcos, and also the military general Suharto, and these are ongoing campaigns again, pushing for redress and rectification that draw upon and cite the present plight of descendants of the original victims, but also the horrors of the period in forging both a past-oriented and a future-oriented defense of reparations.
Mm. I'm just wondering how like punishing the colonizers would exactly look in practice because like the colonizers themselves are dead and it's just
Trials,
their descendants.
good. Three things. One, you can still trial the original colonizers. Two, you can ask that beneficiaries disgorge certain portions of the wealth and to give up, titles, relinquish wealth that's then transferred or
Mm.
used for effective redistribution. Three, descendants. Yes, descendants may not be in favor of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, despite descending from them, so to
Yeah.
speak. So there's no immediate deterrence effect, but there's still a signaling function, right? Which is that past deeds are wrong, past egregious deeds will not go unforgiven and unnoticed, right? We may move on, but we will not forget. We will forgive and yet not forget, okay?
Mm.
And even if we were to forgive, that does not mean that everyone and all can be let off with impunity. So it
Yeah.
still matters as to the present day statements, any actions undertaken by current generations vis-a-vis crimes committed or injustices perpetrated decades ago. They're still relevant, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes sense. So aside from economic or political motivations, do you think there were other motivations behind colonial projects in the past?
Well, probably geopolitical, right? Many empires, the French, the British, Spanish to some extent, certainly the Portuguese, tied a sense of national pride and superiority and a place
Mm.
in the world to narratives of there being the master civilization, the best country there is, the civilizing, okay, source of
Mm.
civilizing transformation in a world filled with what they termed to be, heathens, right? Folks who didn't necessarily understand, queer barbarians, the norms of civility and also didn't have access to God or divine salvation. So there was
Yeah.
this proselytizing ideology, come moralistic narrative and worldview that was undergirding colonialism without, generalizing too much here, right? But furthermore, also a desire to gain a leg up over others. It's a bit like, tutoring, after school tutoring. Hear
Mm.
me out with this slightly farcical analogy. You've got a classmate who looks at you and thinks, well, you're getting very good grades. How can I get better grades? So they get tutoring. And you look at them and say, well, yeah, well, it seems like they're only getting good grades because of tutoring. So I have to tutor as well. And this race to the bottom, this continuous grind, of course, in the case of tutoring, doesn't have any victim barring yourself and maybe the pockets of your parents. But in the case of colonialism, that sort of competition between who has the largest enslaved workforce, who has access to the greatest swathes of land, that became a very toxic, incredibly dehumanizing and debased rat race, where folks were literally racing one another, cf. the race to Africa, or clamoring over colonies to divide up the riches
Mm.
and the wealth to
Yeah.
appropriate from. Now, that to me is perhaps even arguably the most important cause and explanation for colonialism and its excesses and its terrible, terrible consequences and detriments over the past 500, 600 years.
Mm. Yeah, so I feel like there's something intrinsically wrong with this dogmatic worldview that these colonial projects had in mind because it's always good to be accepting of other
Imposed.
cultures.
Imposed.
Yeah, because like maybe like what people consider to be barbaric is only considered barbaric through the lens of their culture, and
For
that's
sure.
like
It's
yeah,
construct. Yeah, I construct, you construct, we all construct our
yeah,
conceptions of barbarism, of lack of civilization or civility, of the purported need for external help. Help is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it
mm,
can stand for genuine empowerment, which is quite rare. On the other hand, it usually manifests as and plays out as dumping of resources, provision of aid to loans that are in turn, unscrupulously deployed and used without accountability. So what does help really mean even for the people on the ground there, right?
mm, yeah, that makes sense. So I guess the next question is colonialism typically leads the cultures of the colonized people to be like transformed or merged or like imposed onto the culture of the colonized people. So do you think cultural syncretism due to colonialism is always wrong?
By cultural syncretism, could you clarify for me, do you see this similar to or different from cultural appropriation?
Uh, I guess it's just a way of merging one's culture with another, which in a way also erases the original culture.
but I don't get why the original culture is erased, right? Because let's hear me out here. Sure, cultures A and B fuse together.
Yeah.
They don't really work like cells, by the way. It's like saying, in a Chinese culture or British culture, they meet and therefore the cells merge. No, I don't think that's how cultures work, right? The interaction and the synthesizing or the synergy between cultures does not lead to the eradication of one or the other. It might lead to the crowding out of certain elements of the original cultures, but it's very rare, if at all, empirically extant, that cultures just merge and the original ones as they stood
Yeah.
disappear. And furthermore, is it even possible to delineate as clearly the boundary between existing and new culture and merged culture, post-merging culture? The lines are very blurred because culture
Yeah,
is
definitely.
an encompassing concept. So, what is Hong Kong culture? Is it having Chinese food, cha chan tang, or is it instead potentially the French toast, or is it Swiss chicken wings? I don't know. All of these are Hong Kong culture or aspects of Hong Kong culture, and yet the definition is expanding and the scope and remit is continually expanding too. So I do not see Hong Kong culture to be a stagnant, nor static, nor enclosed entity, let alone American culture and in brackets cultures, subcultures, regional cultures. You've got different cultures between Oklahoma, Iowa, and also in Nebraska, very different cultures.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'd say cultural syncretism needs to be evaluated carefully as a word that, if it were to mean what you said it meant, I don't think it happens that often, right? That cultures are eradicated or eliminated by fusing with others. And yet, if it's just what do you make of the mixing and matching of cultures that may or may not lead to evolution in the original culture, and then I'd say, well, we've got to look at the actual consequences and the effects of said culture, right? Because you have new norms saying, well, it is culturally vogue to just beat up non-human animals. And that's an awful culture. That's awful because it leads to undesirable consequences, not because, it's change or it's a different culture, it's not the original one. When not something is the original one is besides the point. What matters more is the consequences and the effects of said culture as we come up to the end of this
Yeah,
conversation.
definitely. So speaking of the effects and consequences, how does the colonial history of Hong Kong shape the personal identities of Hong Kong citizens today?
I think in many ways, we have both benefited off and also suffered greatly under colonialism. And in the interest of time, I'd say colonialism has given us a rule of law, common law jurisdiction, has empowered us with capitalist institutions and also an understanding of the role of the market and an appreciation that, not just of the ability to speak English, but also why British culture and also the Anglospheric culture is pretty useful as a source of cultural milieu and capital. And yet it's also left much devastation in its wake. It's created this faux hierarchy where for some bizarre reason, British cultural items and norms and people are valorized over whom we are. We are ethnic Chinese, and yet there's still many in Hong Kong who look down, unfortunately, on their counterparts on the mainland and who worship. I wouldn't say blindly, but pretty zealously and perhaps excessively the practices adopted by the proverbial West. So colonialism certainly has a legacy, and it's not all good. And indeed, even if it were good, that doesn't therefore mean that the initial episodes of violations are justified or just.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the interview today. It was a very insightful
Thank you,
discussion.
Benjamin, and thank you for your time. It was a great conversation. Let's
Yeah.
keeping in touch, and please keep me posted and
Yeah.
abreast
Thank you.
of your developments.